We've been working with FSS since its inception, and as Heather said, done quite a few research projects across a range of topics. I primarily am the numbers man, looking at the quantitative side of things. Some of my qualitative colleagues are in the audience here. The reason we're involved is, as Ross Finney said at the very start, consumers are at the heart of what FSS is trying to do, and we are, if I say so, a way in which we can translate what consumers are saying and inform FSS of what they think. I'm delighted to have been asked here today to share with you some of the insights that we've shared with Food Standards Scotland. And over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to try and cover quite a lot of ground. I hope it's going to give you all a good introduction to what the public in Scotland think. The title of my presentation is Emerging Trends in Consumer Attitudes to Food. Whilst I'm sure some of the key themes and some of the things I've got to say are going to be familiar to some of you already, I'm hoping that we can show you over the few years we've been doing this what changes we are starting to see, and not just changes but also where things are stubbornly not changing. And that's going to give us an idea of the sort of things and the sort of areas that the food sector is facing at the moment. So most of what I'm going to talk about this morning is from Food Standards Scotland's Food in Scotland Consumer Tracking Survey. And when FSS was established, as I said, there was a desire to better understand and to monitor Scotland's knowledge, attitudes and behaviours in relation to food. And so we were tasked with creating a survey to do just that. We run the survey twice a year. And although we've got some questions, as you'll see, that we ask every time we run the survey, we also have a modular approach whereby we alternate two different topics. So we cover food safety and authenticity and also diet and nutrition. And by alternating those, we ensure that we've got measures that cover all of FSS's strategic objectives. We've conducted 5 waves of the survey to date, beginning in December 2015. And at each wave, we interview, using an online survey, it's a sample of 1,000 adults, 16 and over, who are representative of the population of Scotland. So as I say, we're very much looking at that representation of the country as a whole and what they think. So I thought a good place to start would be to look at what are people's current concerns. Now, at each wave, we ask people to select from a prompted list which food issues they say concerns them the most. Now, to date, consumers have been most concerned about making sure that they and their family eat a healthy, balanced diet. That's the green line at the top of the chart. And over the course of our tracking, that's something that's become more important to people, increasing from 31% saying that's the most important thing, up to 35%. Concern about becoming ill through eating unsafe foods, the next most concerning issue, although this appears to be waning slightly over time. That's gone down from 30% to 26%. Following on from a lot of what Ewan was just saying there, currently not being able to afford a healthy, balanced diet is next. And that is increasingly becoming a concern. You can see the pink line going from 16% when we first started up to 20% at the most recent wave in December past. So again, this is always what people are telling us. It's really interesting to see the other side of the coin in terms of the actual figures and how prices are increasing. So it's definitely being translated into people's perceptions. And finally, we included an option regarding food authenticity. And we've seen that this has fallen slightly over time from 21 down to 18. Again, when we first started this, it was just in the immediate time around or the aftermath of the horse meat scandal. So as that has waned over time without too many major incidents, that has disappeared slightly. And I only have one slide on Brexit. We just have one question that we ask people about their potential, their perceptions of the potential consequences. And we ask consumers whether they think a range of issues relating to food are likely to get better on the left in green, or whether they're likely to get worse as a result of Brexit. Now, overall, you can see that people's perceptions, again, this is December last year, are, I would say, almost overwhelmingly that things are likely to get worse rather than to get better. One area that absolutely stands out, just echoing everything that we've just been hearing about, is that the price of food is going to get worse, 64% saying that that's going to be more of a problem. Now, no doubt that's just tied in with all the general discussion commentary about the economic consequences, but I think that's just such a more tangible thing for people that they can see already what the consequences of that might be. The other thing to note on here, I've not shown, we have asked this for a few waves, I've not shown on here, the other thing that we noticed at the most recent wave is actually a significant increase in the proportion of people who think food safety is going to get worse. So the 23% in December actually went up from 18% 6 months prior to that. And I think, again, there's probably an increasing discussion in the media, I think fair to say, about things like chlorinated chicken, the quality of things that are going to be coming into the country. So people are picking up on that kind of chat and commentary, and that's coming through here as well. So moving on now to look specifically at diet and nutrition. Now, we ask a number of attitudinal questions in the survey, and here I'm showing the results of some of the general statements that we ask people about Scotland's diet, and again, the results here are from the most recent wave in December. So we find that 3/4 of people tell us that there are too many people who eat unhealthily in Scotland. When we ask people how serious they think how serious a problem they think obesity is in Scotland today, 91% agree that it's a serious problem, and actually 46% say that it's very serious. And we get another 3/4 saying that I know in Scotland we have to make some significant changes to what we need to eat to be more healthy. So overall, among the public, there is a widespread recognition of the current poor state of Scotland's diet. However, when we ask people about their own diets, a slightly different picture emerges. We ask people to tell us whether they think the kinds of food they normally eat nowadays, both meals and snacks, are healthy or not. And you can see here, this is one of the questions that we ask at every wave of the survey. In general, we find just over half of people claiming that their diet is healthy, although to be fair, fewer than 1 in 10 claiming that they're very healthy. In spite of that, and in spite of the widespread concern over Scotland's diet generally, only around 1 in 7 saying that they're not very healthy, with very small numbers, so small that I've taken the numbers off because it just makes the chart look untidy, so small that they think that they are not at all healthy. So what we can see from that is a huge degree of deflection among the public who think that everyone else must be bad, but I personally am doing absolutely fine. And of course, as we've already talked about, that has huge implications in terms of the messaging and persuading people to make some of the changes that are needed. Having said that, we do see some recognition that people acknowledge they have a personal responsibility for their diet. The proportion of people who agree that the green line, I eat too many treats like cakes, biscuits, chocolates or sweets every day, that increased over the last 2 years from 41% up to 47%. So over the last little while, there has been some acknowledgement of people's, they do perceive that they're eating to be not quite right. We also saw some improvement in the proportion agreeing that I know I need to do something to eat more healthily. Now, that rose significantly over the first year, up from 51% to 61% of people agreeing. It's actually dropped back down over the last year. Now, that could be something, as well, as I say, we will monitor these over time. But again, that increasing acknowledgement or recognition in the green line that I maybe actually do some of these things a little bit too much is maybe starting to make people think that actually I do need to do something more healthily about it, and maybe starting to take action and therefore less likely to think about it. And very briefly here, we see a very similar situation when it comes to attitudes towards children and their diet. There is some concern. 3/4 in this instance of all adults consistently state that I think there are too many children who are not a healthy weight and age for their height. That's the orange line. And we have half of parents, the purple line, agreeing that I am worried about the types of food that my children are eating. But we do also see, in the same way, parents deflecting, with 3/4 believing that their children are a healthy weight and age for their height. So again, that makes it all the more difficult to communicate that message if parents don't necessarily feel it's relevant to their own families. So when we think about what might help us to encourage people to change their attitudes and behaviours in relation to diet, there's often, as Sir Kenneth was talking about, a focus on highlighting the negative consequences of unhealthy foods. But in general, the survey shows us that those negative consequences are already really very well understood among the general public. So 4/5 agree that they know that an unhealthy diet can cause lots of health problems like cancer and heart disease. And in terms of the specifics. 90% know that too much sugar can lead to obesity, 87% that too much salt can raise your blood pressure, 86% that too much fat can lead to obesity, and 4/5 that being overweight or obese can cause some types of cancer. But in spite of that level of knowledge and apparent understanding, other results in the survey quite clearly highlight that that knowledge, as many of you know, doesn't translate into action. When we ask consumers in the two top left boxes their thoughts on sugary drinks, we find 83% of people agreeing that, yes, of course I should avoid sugary drinks, such as colas and lemonades. 63% agreeing that I should only have fruit juice in small amounts. But on the right-hand side, when we ask them to tell us to indicate their general consumption of those things, 69% saying that they drink sugary drinks in an average week, and 59% that they drink sugary drinks once a day or more. And we see a very similar pattern when it comes to alcoholic drinks. 87% agree that alcoholic drinks can be high in calories. 41% say that they never think about calories when they're drinking alcohol. And I haven't gone into any great detail today in terms of things like snacking and 5 a day, but we see exactly the same patterns when it comes to those kind of things. And I think it's fair to say it's not just this project, it's not just this work, it's not just the work we do for Food Standards Scotland. This is something we see across quantitative work, qualitative work. These messages have landed with people, but getting them to take action is the difficult thing. Eating out is another area where we see barriers to healthy eating, with many people feeling that the choices that are available to them to eat healthily when they're out makes it very difficult to do so. On the left-hand side, when we ask people directly how easy or difficult is it for you to eat healthily outside of the home, 55% of consumers say it's easy, 45% say it's difficult. And that's partly because of the general perception held by about 3/5 that there are not enough healthy choices when eating out. And then 3/4 saying that the type of food that is the most convenient to buy outside of the home is usually the least healthy. But given that overall impression of lack of choice and options when eating out, it's unsurprising that when we ask people's opinions on potential changes that could be made, there is actually quite a good deal of support for increasing the number of healthy options that are available and for better promotion of these. Specifically, portion sizes and calorie information are things that people claim they would like to see changes in. So generally, a large proportion, 82% of people, agree that everyone should be able to have the choice around the size of their portion rather than having it dictated to them by the establishment. And 42% agree that portion sizes when eating out are just too big. And a larger proportion, 52%, believe that the sizes of drinks and snacks in cinemas should be reduced. When it comes to displaying calorie information on menus and cafes and restaurants, 66% say that they'd like to see that happen more often, and I know that's something that FSS have been working on recently as well. Now, it's not just food establishments where consumers would like to see some action being taken. We've also seen an increase over time in the proportion of people who agree with the pink line. It's not up to me, it's up to others, such as supermarkets, food manufacturers and the government, to make the food we buy healthier. And that has risen over the last 2 years from 24% up to 28%. And specifically, concern over promotions on unhealthy foods has also increased up. That went from 66 when we started up to 71 last June. And interestingly, that's another one that, following that increasing trend upwards, has just taken a little dip at the most recent wave. My personal feeling on that is that in that last little spell, there has been a lot more chat about the industry starting to take action on some of those things. So that might be some of that starting to make its way into people's perceptions. And in addition to educating and persuading the public, and indeed manufacturers and sellers, to eat more healthily, there are other levers to encourage behaviour change, and there is some evidence in the tracking of support, and indeed increasing support over time, for both further regulation and taxation. So on the left-hand side, we have 3/4 of people who are in favour of the government limiting the amount of sugar, fat or salt that is added to manufactured food. And on the other three areas, which relate to taxation, so support is perhaps unsurprisingly a little bit lower, but there is still support for taxes being applied to unhealthy products. Nonetheless, as I say, a good level of support, and again, between June 2016 and June 2017, we saw support for each of those measures of taxation increasing over time. Okay, that's a lot of information on diet and nutrition. I also want to take the opportunity to share a little on one of the other main areas of the tracking, which is food safety and hygiene. Firstly, in this area, we also see evidence that the general public already feel that they are very well informed about food safety and food hygiene. We ask people, do you have clear information on how to prepare and cook food safely and hygienically in the home? And a consistent 9 out of 10 people tell us that they do. And we see that same level, very high level, across virtually all demographic groups. The only exception, or the only one that at the most recent wave was under 90%, was among 16 to 34-year-olds who do have a slightly different view towards food safety generally. But in the same way that we saw knowledge about diet itself doesn't necessarily translate into good behaviours, we also see the same when it comes to food safety. We have a lot of measures in the survey relating to food safety. I don't have the time to go into it in any great detail here today. But what we do is we ask those people who are responsible for preparing and cooking food in the home the extent to which they follow a number of different recommended practices. And we analyse all that and come up with an average number. So we find that 11 out of 9, the average number of recommended practices that are consistently followed by consumers is just over half, 11 out of the 19 that we measure in the survey. So still a lot of room for progress in that front. Just to give you a flavour of some of those, I've included 3 on the right-hand side. We have 3/4 of people who tell us they always wash their hands after handling raw meat, poultry or fish. I don't want anybody to have a heart attack. The other 25% don't never do it. They do it most of the time, or sometimes. It's a very, very small number who tell us they never do it. We have 62% who say that they store raw meat or poultry on the bottom shelf of the fridge, and 46% saying that they never wash raw chicken or poultry. And we're going to look a little bit more at that last one here. I know this is often an area of focus, and so at the latest wave of the survey, to understand a little bit more about it, we asked people, what are your views on washing raw poultry? And again, we did provide them with a list, so these answers are from a prompted list. But overall, 58% of the public said that you should not wash raw poultry, 45% clearly indicating that they knew that was because there's a danger of splashing bacteria around the kitchen. So there's already a very good knowledge of that particular aspect of it. However, we do have 2/5 saying that you should wash raw poultry, essentially one way or another, because it's dirty. It's either been handled, you need to remove chemicals or pesticides, you need to wash it to get dirt off. For many people, I think that's still an old habit, dying hard, and you can see I've added one of the few instances in here. I've put any subgroup information, but you can see significantly higher numbers of those age 65 plus still believing that you should wash raw poultry. The interesting thing, however, is we do also have significantly higher levels among 16 to 24s. So again, that general food safety among the younger audience, whether it's a lack of education or bad habits being passed down, that's a bit more of a challenge getting to that younger audience. And we all know why this is important, given the potential consequences of not following these recommended practices. And indeed, when we ask people if they've ever personally experienced food poisoning, we do see that this is creeping up. So the pink on the far left of the chart, it's not a significant change over time, but the proportion who say they've had food poisoning in the last year going up from 4 to 5 to 6% in the most recent survey. Interestingly, though, when we ask people what they think the cause of the food poisoning was on the last occasion, people are far more likely to be blaming the out-of-home environment, so 34% saying it's from a cafe or restaurant, 27% from a takeaway, and fewer than 1 in 10 acknowledging that they personally could be to blame for the incident. And we see this issue in attitudes to food poisoning as well, which clearly show a lack of understanding of both the likelihood of food poisoning and the seriousness of food poisoning in the home. 19% agree that no one gets very ill from food prepared in their own kitchen. Although despite that, 31% recognise that there are health risks to, at the very least, young children and the elderly from food that's prepared at home. And whilst 83% agree that there are lots of easy things to do in the kitchen to reduce the food poisoning, we have still over a quarter, 28%, who say that they use the 5-second rule sometimes as a way of deciding if something is safe to eat or cook. So a very conflicting opinions and attitudes there. And finally, I thought it might be interesting for all of us in the room to know what the public thinks about the experts and what we have to tell them. And I think, again, it's fair to say that consumers have quite conflicting opinions of expert advice, again, echoing what Sir Kenneth was saying this morning. The top line on the chart here is the proportion of people who agree that they have clear information on how to eat a balanced diet. That has fluctuated, it's dipped a little bit, but pretty consistently 9 out of 10 people agreeing that they do. However, over 2/3 agree that the experts contradict each other on what foods are good for you or bad for you. To be fair, how much of that is the experts versus the media versus the messaging that's being communicated, who can say? But as Sir Kenneth was talking about earlier, that then translates into 33% of people at the most recent wave saying, I get confused over what's supposed to be healthy and what isn't. And more worryingly, in the green line, 2/5 of people saying that there's so much advice about food, I tend to ignore it now. All of which means that it's important for consumers to have a clear and trusted source of information, which brings me nicely finally, to Food Standards Scotland itself. So in the survey, we asked people whether they'd heard of Food Standards Scotland, and if those people who had heard of the organisation, how much they trust it. And in both cases, we've seen significant increases in both awareness and trust since the start of the tracking. And the more that Food Standards Scotland becomes known as the voice of authority on all the range of issues that are within its remit, the more that consumers will be able to trust it as the expert voice who is speaking for them. So to conclude, again, just to summarise some of the key things I've talked about this morning, in terms of people's concerns, people are most concerned consistently about having a healthy diet, but affordability is increasingly becoming a concern, and that's amplified by Brexit. There is a widespread recognition that Scotland's diet needs to change. The public know that, and many do acknowledge some level of personal responsibility for their own diet, but we've also continued to consistently see a high level of deflection about one's own eating habits, and that's continuing to act as a barrier. The negative impact of unhealthy foods is already very well understood, but isn't reflected in claimed behaviour and consumption. So again, just echoing what was talked about before, that negative messaging. Those messages have landed and people get that, so there's got to be other ways of helping and supporting the right audience to make those changes. There are several perceived barriers to being healthy when you're eating out of home, but there are support for a whole raft of changes to make that easier. And there's also an increasing expectation that if those changes that aren't necessarily voluntarily taken, that the food industry might need to be taxed or regulated to make some of that happen and to enforce it. And although consumers believe they're preparing and cooking food safely, there is room for improvement in following a whole range of the recommended practices. So that was a very, very quick introduction to the large amount of information that we have. I hope you find it useful and a good introduction, and I'll be happy to take any questions as and when we get to the panel later. Thank you very much.